Alright, so I'm a massive cynic, which probably comes as no surprise to many of you, but I'm especially cynical when it comes to intensely on-the-nose philosophical storytelling because I personally find philosophy to be a prime example of something that can so easily fall into pseudo-intellectualism because it really isn't all that hard to make something appear deep without justification. It's not like I've ever read that criticism in the comments before. Now, don't get me wrong, when it comes to analysis, the expression of thought, regardless of how complex or abstract it is, allows us to connect with stories on a more personal and profound level, beyond just the smokescreen of entertainment value. At the same time, I'm a hypocrite for saying artsy-fartsy intellectualism shouldn't overshadow entertainment value, but when a piece of media finds the perfect wee balance between emotionally stimulating and provocatively introspective, that to me is what I call a masterpiece. It's something that goes above and beyond the intent of its genre and story, when mere spectacle and intrigue transcend a pastime into an experience. I've never said this out loud before, but Donnie Darko is my favourite film of all time for the reasons I've just described. It's emotional, meaningful, creative, and it's the kind of story that makes you think more about your place in this world. Except until the day comes that I finally cover the terrifying philosophy of Donnie Darko, there was another film I actually watched alongside it that has always rested deep in the back of my mind because it's a film that I've genuinely and wholeheartedly never knew what to make of it. Until my patrons decided to vote for it, so let's talk about Cube. Philosophy sometimes feels like trying to answer a question with another question, or giving some long-winded answer to a question that wasn't even asked to begin with. Sure, there are hundreds of brilliant philosophical stories out there that introduce new concepts without overindulging in their ideas or getting lost in thought, much like these videos, but I like to use Cube as the definitive example of philosophical storytelling 101, where a science fiction horror about a group of strangers trying to escape a complex maze of cubes containing deadly traps turns into an exploration over what the purpose of their ordeal is really about. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the fundamental theme of many horror films, but Cube is a film that kind of gives off the illusion of a narrative journey than what is actually going on. The title Cube basically speaks for itself. It's more of an idea than the creepy sci-fi flick that it is, because instead of just giving us some cut and dry, organically delivered story, it likes to call attention to the formula of said story. That is, a conflict involving characters with realistic behaviours, and a journey defined by a goal that's met with contextually treacherous dangers, challenges and tribulations that fit the structure of the traditional monomyth, as defined by Joseph Campbell in his influential book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Look, I've referenced this book enough times since the start of my academic days that I could live peacefully without ever having to open it again, but it is the unquestionable go-to book for understanding structures in storytelling mythology. Effectively, every story in existence right back to the start of time can basically be broken down into the same pattern of events. Naturally, pedantic contrarians out there will go, well actually that's not true because yes, I'm not going to get into the very long-standing debate around it, so getting to the point, Cube takes your typical generic storytelling structure that's especially prolific in science fiction and essentially strips it down into a series of literal obstacles that leave the characters questioning why. It's easy to summarize Cube as just an early sophisticated sci-fi version of what Saw eventually tried to be, but without an elaborate villain and with better character development, except for all the talk about the unpredictable traps in the various rooms that keep a persistent tension and uncertainty to the film. They're really not the main feature of the story. In fact, only 2 characters die as a result of the traps, and one of them was just an opening kill to establish the brooding danger of the film. Instead, the real danger comes naturally from certain characters as they become dehydrated, disorientated, and pure deranged, that reveals more and more about them as the film progresses. In the vein of its breakdown of the monomyth, the characters are introduced in a very archetypical fashion. You have the smart one, the calm one, the domineering one, the mysterious one, and the one with autism purely for the purposes of added drama and acting as a late reveal plot device.
This room is green.
At first, in the mathematical sense of the film, the characters are pretty binary. Their traits are kinda black and white, but as they start to question their circumstances more and more, and begin facing their mortality, they do develop into more human characters. In other words, I find them to be deliberately one-note at first, only for their emotions to get the better of them, and they begin to act more naturally. For example, the Doctor starts out calmly and collectively trying to help everyone, yet as her fears escalate, she devolves into a more selfish, irrational and anxious character that completely contrasts with the archetype she's initially established with. I could do this for all the characters, but her one is the most jarring because it calls so much attention to itself that I assume that it must be intentional, especially considering Quentin is set up as the hero who takes on the most responsibility, only to eventually turn into a killer. In another story, this would be seen as a very abrupt transformation that's almost inorganic, but the first frame we see of Quentin, he has blood on his hands that's easy to miss, which acts as the first symbol that all these strangers are simply hiding behind the shells of their archetypes. They are ordinary people put in a position where they must adhere to characterization, since we, as the audience, are practically the voyeuristic observers to this unexplained game show they think they're participating in, that it partially breaks the fourth wall. Now, going back a bit, the proof of concept behind Cube came in the form of a short film called Elevated, about three strangers who get stuck in an elevator where, according to the unstable, clearly untrustworthy one, a monster apparently lurks outside killing people. Taking into account such a ridiculously far-fetched story while the stranger is covered in blood and wielding a knife, you immediately call him out as the obvious imposter, but then again, that seems a little too obvious, so yeah, it's just a relatively bad attempt at a red herring, but there is something sincere and fearful about his performance. He doesn't try to control the situation, he isn't trying to dominate the group. Instead, it's actually the other guy who seems more aggressive and in control despite being initially established as the everyday hero. And then when the unstable guy lets the two leave without any resistance, the girl notices the apparent hero concealing the unstable guy's knife and she jumps back into the elevator, to which the story concludes with the monster in fact being real, while the girl stabs the unstable guy to death. What keeps it so compelling is the constantly shifting dynamic of the characters, for as predictable as it is, it does play extremely well on the premise that you have no idea what the strangers standing next to you are capable of. It's about that external mask or shell. On the outside we might get an idea as to who someone might be, but we can't trust that to be a representation of who they actually are on the inside. And since being trapped in a tight, uncomfortable, claustrophobic environment is such a common human fear, it has a way of grounding such an absurd premise. And that's exactly what keeps Cube feeling so uneasy the whole way through. The traps become an afterthought to the characters as they begin to understand the algorithm on how to avoid them. In this sense, the obstacle just becomes a checkbox to get to an uncertain finish line because survival is the one and only priority. When the characters try to make sense of what this situation is all about, that really is the least of their worries to getting out alive. But we, as the audience, are in a position where answers are important to us. Is it hell, a prison, a game show, a government conspiracy, aliens, or just a bad dream? The possibilities are endless because we're trapped with the characters in the internal structure of the cube with absolutely no context to what is outside. There is no understanding of place or time. Everything is defined simply by a number and sequence that's open to interpretation. It's the literal framework of a traditional sci-fi setup. After all, the story is about escaping an unfamiliar place and getting home. And by stripping it of a geographical aesthetic that we can interpret, whether it be organic or alien, what we're left with is a journey that's so abstract and devoid of reason or purpose or even logic that it's no surprise that to find the exit, they end up back where they started. The film fundamentally de-emphasizes setting. It calls attention to the fact that logic is kind of flexible because we have no understanding of what's outside the box. When the characters do discuss it, they simply scrutinize the point of it. That is, when the mysterious guy reveals he designed it without any further insight, we have some characters trying to see this ordeal as some higher divine purpose, while he simply sees it with nihilism. In his words, there is no reason to why they created it, but they did, so they have to use it or admit that it's pointless. I saw it as hinting at some sort of capitalist government criticism, something about excess and power to prove their authority and control, or at least the illusion of it, given the film itself feels like an illusion as well. I guess that's where it's entirely up to you to interpret and give it that meaning. I don't even think it implies anything further to go beyond the idea that the point of the cube is entirely irrelevant. They do things because they can and have to, or they'll look insignificant. Whether you interpret it as a socio-political message or even a criticism to fiction in general, the point still stands that the characters start on a path defined by personal choice and preference, with no idea where this path may lead. But when they start to search for meaning to it, that is, the algorithm to bypass the traps, they end up on a path that's based on the assumption of logic that they can't control. They try to follow rules and interpret what is given to them, but at the end of it all, there is nothing to define their logic. It's simply trying to give a resolution or answer to a problem they don't understand. And really, how do you give an answer if you don't understand the question? While the sequels essentially contradicted to try and give answers to questions that were not the point of the first film, to go with the flow of the original, you simply have to embrace the existentialism that it puts across. You have to let go of logic for just a moment and, I guess, in a strange paradox, challenge the purpose of purpose. Are we watching Cube for answers to questions we never asked to begin with, or are we just casual observers to shameless entertainment that, cynically speaking, in the eyes of one character, is purely about escapism from a world that makes so little sense to begin with? Hey folks, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on Cube in the comments below, because my brain is absolutely fried thinking about it, and I'm very curious to see what folks have to say about it and how they interpret the film. There's a lot you can say about it, especially the filmmaker's other work as well, which I've not seen, but maybe you can recommend it to me. If you enjoyed this episode and you enjoy what I do here and you want to get early access, you want to vote on what the next video could be, like this one, get your name in the credits and get into our exclusive Discord community where you can talk about anything from games, comic books to movies and anything you want. My brain is fried. The possibilities are endless, you know, free speech and all that. Consider heading over to Patreon, where for just a few dollars a month you'll get access to all those features. And until next time, stay very, very safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.